Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. My mom and I lived alone in a small house in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent. And that fact, combined with her paranoia about me being home alone longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over a friend's house while she was gone. This friend's house was across the street, and over one house from my own. The place my mom was going was only about 2 hours away, and I'd gotten a bug up my arse about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me. So for the week leading up to the trip, I was moaning and groaning about being old enough to take care of myself, and insisted that I could just check in with my friend's parents every now and then. But in truth, my house was pretty creepy at night. When my mum was there with me, and I'd found out the day my mum was scheduled to leave, that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PlayStation 3. So, it didn't take me long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back in my friend's room screwing around with the brand new flip phone I'd gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier, after buying us pizza for dinner, and probably weren't going to be back for at least an hour. We'd gotten bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we'd been playing for days already. As it turns out, she had the PlayStation but didn't have any money to actually buy games for it. That's how it usually goes though, right? I was too late to call any of our friends, but I knew my mum was coming home tomorrow morning, at some ungodly hour, and I knew that she had this thing about our answering machine. No matter how tired she was, no matter how she'd gotten back, she would press the button and listen to all of them. Being the bored 15-year-olds we were, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mum in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to be. It normally took 5 rings for the call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd, the phone picks up and we hear, "Hello?" The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old guy who'd been smoking for the last 40. But even past that, there was this menace to his voice. I can't describe it, but it sounded very cold and very dangerous. The sort of voice you heard on the street that you knew you wanted to get away from that person immediately. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were huge and her face completely pale, and I'm sure I didn't look any better. Neither of us could get anything together to say a response. "Hello?" he said again. Then there was a pause, and I tried to squeak something to the lines of, "Who the hell are you and why are you in my house?" But then he said in a very low voice, "You shouldn't have called." And there was some sort of slam as the call disconnected. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak out, as did my friend. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know the creepy-ass guy answering my phone at 11 at night. We checked the call log to see if we'd accidentally called the wrong number. Nope, right number. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we called or what we should do. If we should call the cops, or call my mom or call my friend's parents, or run around making sure all the doors and windows were locked or what. So we ended up sprinting around my friend's house, double checking every lock we could, whilst gasping out of what happened to my friend's parents on the phone. They were about 15 minutes away and said they would call 911, and her mother told us to stay in my friend's room with the door locked and all the lights on in case the guy was going from house to house. And so for 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled or one of our legs scraped on the carpet. The cops got to my house, and not too long after, her parents got home. To be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside the house. But I remember they asked my friend and I a lot of questions. We couldn't really give them a lot of info though. Unfortunately, we called from my friend's room, which was in the back of her house, away from where we would have been able to see my house and the dude with a creepy smoker's voice. It isn't a very helpful description to go off when you're looking for someone. One question they asked though stuck out, because I remember thinking it was weird for them to ask who had keys to get into the house. I told them my mum and I were the only ones with keys. I found out later that the reason the police asked was because there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, and that the front door was wide open when they arrived. There wasn't really anything messed up, and nothing was taken, but our wall-mounted cord phone was hanging off the hook, and the phone base itself was cracked, like it had been smashed with something. Both my mum's room and my room had some stuff moved around and displaced, like someone was going through our drawers and the stuff in our rooms. My mum got called at some point during all of this and managed to get home that night, very tired and very freaked out about what happened. The cops investigated the incident, but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at that point, but we still managed to move across town within a few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved though, I slept like shit and really had bad nightmares. I also flat out refused to be alone in the house, even for a couple of minutes, and I started getting really obsessive about checking and double checking the locks, a habit which has remained with me to this day. And now that I've said all this, I remember that there's one thing I haven't told anyone, mostly because at the time I thought the whole thing might get blamed on me. Earlier that day, I'd gone back over to my house to grab a notebook full of my writings that I wanted to show to my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got to it, no signs of tampering with it or any weirdness by the door. No noises from any part of the house, but the minute I stepped inside, something just felt off. Really off. It was really quiet, and I was getting chills up and down my spine, and I had goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself to just get over it, to go back to my room and get to the notebook. But I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps into the house. So I locked the door and ran back across the street. When I got back to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot. Of course, was I really such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house when it was empty? But looking back, who knows? Maybe my gut was right about something, just not being right there. Freaks me out even thinking about what could have happened if I'd ignored it and walked further inside. I've thought back on that moment a lot too, wondering if maybe I left the door open when I left, but there's no way. I distinctly remember locking the deadlock and looking over my shoulder the whole time, because I had that burning, crawling feeling on the back of my neck, the one you get when you're being watched. And so after the creepy call, I checked and I had my keys in my backpack. I really hope I don't have the misfortune of encountering that creepy home intruder ever again. My freshman year of college was one of the funnest years of my life, and some of my fondest memories are from that year. But it was also the scariest and strangest year to date. I'm 31 now, and this is thanks to one story in particular that takes place over the entire school year. I still sometimes wonder how this really happened, and I didn't end up a shut-in nut job, and it still freaks me out to this day. I've only started talking about it once or twice since it happened 13 years ago. August 2001. Like most freshmen, I lived in the dorms at a state party school. I opted out of the good school I got into. I guess I had a little steam to blow off after graduating from a military college/prep boarding school. Plus, after a sports injury, I didn't exactly have any specific plan for life that went past Saturday night, if you know what I mean. A good buddy from military school, Bill, went to the same college and lived a few floors below the same dorm as me. So of course, we were getting the party started before my parents' exhausted fumes had even evaporated from the parking lot. For the most part, the first month or so of college was pretty much like that. Normal. I went to most of my classes, partied just about every night, chased girls around, and that was enough for the moment. But things began to change one night, sometime in mid-September, and college for me would never be normal again. My dorm phone rings in the middle of the night. It's a landline, so I answer. Hello? On the other end, I can only really describe the voice as the kind of picture when you think about a computer talking. Kind of like the early car models of GPS. Hi, Gary. How are you today? Not fully awake. I just was confused at this point. Who is this? He repeats. Hi, Gary. How are you today? It became clear I'm being screwed with, so I hang up and chuckle. Screw Bill, nice one. And I pass back out. I ended up forgetting about the call for a few days and never mentioned it to Bill or anyone else. About a week later, I get another call around the same time of night. Hi, Gary. I'm watching you. Nice. Very cliché. Seriously, Bill, how are you not knee-deep in Everclear or a Tri-Delt at this hour? Enough already. Cade, my roommate, was starting to get pissed, and I hang up. I usually confront my oh-so-clever amigo at breakfast the next morning. I casually confront my oh-so-clever amigo at breakfast the next morning, purposely not trying to bite too hard to give him a payoff that might incentivize continued calls. I also wasn't 100% sure it was actually him, and not after another one of my douchebag friends. He gives me a genuinely confused response. Whatever. So a couple of days later, after the second call, I come home and see some messages on the answering machine. Whoa, I barely knew that thing worked. It was the computer voice guy. As my machine cuts off for the first 1 or 2 seconds of the message, it tells me it's a bot set to play messages upon answering. "Hi Gary, I'm watching you." The second message goes, "I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary." The third message, "Where might Gary be on a Tuesday night?" Okay, so one of my friends is clearly being an asshole or bored enough to really push for a reaction here. The next day, I play the message for Cade, who was around during the calls, which were apparently earlier in the night when he was still awake. He'd been a close buddy of mine since we were in junior high, but we'd sort of taken separate paths after high school. So anyway, he's aware that I'm a wild child and thinks nothing of the first couple of messages. But by the third, he's a little spooked. I then walk down to a couple of other buddies' rooms and casually, but immediately, bring up the subject. Nada. Over the next couple of days, I press my close and semi-close friends, but get zero answers and zero suspects. The calls start coming more frequently over the next couple of months, starting at once a week, then once every 2 to 3 days, up to every day by Christmas break. I don't say anything to my family at that point, although I really should have. What started out as a decent beginning of college turned into not showing up for any classes, tests, nothing. Grades reflect, and I'm too busy answering for a 0.67 GPA to talk about some dumb prank that would likely be dismissed as a pathetic attempt at grades explanation. Uneventful break, and back to school determined to become a new man I go. I have got to get my shit together with these shit grades, so I tell Bill I'm gonna have to chill out and focus on school. That didn't last. First night back, I get my first spring semester call from the creepy guy. "How is your family in Cyprus?" which is my hometown suburb. Okay, now this is bullshit. What kind of douche lords am I hanging out with that even have the discipline to drag out a prank this long? I get the answer to that question a few days later, and the answer is none of them. Calls become threatening and downright dark. "I'm very interested, Gary, in being close to you." Yeah, with kind of the weird sentence structure like that. "I have tools I can bring. It is going to be all over soon." One day, I bring Brill and all my other buddies up to hear the messages, as I never deleted a single one. I guess when things happen over long periods of time, you don't really feel the cumulative impact until laying out the complete package of evidence. The guys are in shock, I guess. I should mention that some of these calls got really specific in making sure to note specific details about my parents' address, as well as the violence they were planning to do to me. "Cut open your esophagus, Gary, with a butter knife," and all sorts of other crap that is sort of blurred together through the hundreds upon hundreds of calls I received over the school year. A chick friend of mine that I'd recently got in contact with, who I liked a lot during high school, called Layla, reconnected with me thanks to good old AIM, and talked from time to time over the phone. The creepy stalker had mentioned a couple of times, "your friend," and made threats about this unspecified person from time to time. But your friend turned into your friend Layla. Layla and I are the only two people ever named in these calls, but it did get me wondering if this was a new lead to the source. Layla, however, is clueless when I call her about it. Awesome. I know that background was a lot to digest, but you'll understand why I had to explain the situation when you learn the rest of the story. So one night, we're all partying and drinking at some hotel. And of course, that straight-A student crap went out of the window as the events progressed. A different buddy, Carl, had a nice big truck we'd all go everywhere in. But he'd passed out drunk at the hotel after pounding an entire bottle of God knows what. I'm not really drinking tonight and wanted to get back to my own bed, so I snatched Carl's keys and drive back down to campus, thinking I'll drive back in the morning to get everyone. This was one of the few times I'd ever driven that year, so I wasn't tip-top on my directions. I make an early turn and am somehow down a road I'd never seen. I realize this pretty quickly, but I figure out I've got the general direction of campus pegged, so I can just continue the wrong road until hitting a familiar highway that I knew I'd eventually have to hit as it's close to campus. I'm finding myself in open fields, still a paved road and everything, but aside from the road, there was absolutely nothing, and it was completely black. Around 3 a.m, there's this really strange four-way stop which I come across. Strange because I'm probably the fourth person in a year to drive on it. Anyway, I trudge along, eventually getting to the familiar highway, and I'm home free. A few days later, the weird creep interrupts his usual depraved threatenings to mention that specific four-way, the day and the time that I was on it, which, like I said, was around 3 a.m, and I can guarantee to you that there wasn't a soul in sight. So yeah, I now realize this creeper is obviously tracking my movements somehow. I also want to point out that after this I joined the military. I worked in the intelligence community and worked special operations and tracked bad guys all around the world. To this day, I still can't quite figure out how this dude knew I was in the middle of those fields on that day in the middle of the night. I never mentioned it to anyone. Around March, this apparent rendezvous became the creeper's focal point, as he'd start making sure to let me know the day was close. The calls were coming in no fewer than 15 times every single day. Seriously, the ringer was now off out of courtesy to Cade, and I turned down the volume of the answering machine as his phone call was recorded. But I finally get the message I'd been waiting for. Keep in mind, I've now been somewhat infamous at the university because of the stalker. People were constantly knocking on my door, wanting to hear the messages. Friends of friends of everyone I knew would come around and would talk about it at parties. For a split second, it was cool, because I'm pretty sure I ended up getting a few dates indirectly from introductions conceived through the interest of the guy with the stalker. Don't judge me. Moving right along. The day, time, location are all set. We will meet in front of Coleman Hall at midnight, Wednesday, 27 April, and we will take our friendship to the next level. I know what you're thinking, and yeah, throughout the year I had considered the possibility that I was dealing with a girl. Hell hath no wrath like a woman scorned, and I was definitely the kind of dude that would leave young girls in their wake, and I attracted clinginess and anger. But I started to rule out females for various reasons. I can build profiles with a very high ratio of accuracy. This creep just didn't fit the profile to me. It didn't even feel like a peer. I was convinced I was dealing with a mid-30s white male computer nerd that I'd come into contact with at some point in my life. It really didn't matter, because what I ended up finding out on that day, which by the way was Layla's birthday, is that I was wrong. Of course, everyone wants this to be the juicy part of the story, and there's a pretty ridiculous amount of testosterone floating around the dorm on game day. This was a real-life creepster, and a legit horror story unfolding before their very eyes. And groupthink will subvert caution if properly motivated. These guys are ready to defend me with their lives. Just ask them. So while these monkeys are getting all hopped up on Mountain Dew, I stay home that afternoon, wondering what the hell I was going to do at midnight. Of course I was gonna go. But dude, yeah, I've always been an athlete, in good shape, and have done wrestling, football, baseball, the works. I'm still a 19-year-old male, with good parents and grew up in a good neighborhood. And I think I can definitely hold my own in a street fight. But this, whatever this is, didn't feel like a street fight, or any other kind of fight that I'd been in. This is a disturbed, violent, angry, possibly grown-ass psychopath that has decided to dedicate almost a full year now of his life to targeting and terrorizing me. So yeah, I'm pretty frickin' nervous. My home team crowd steadily built up throughout the afternoon and evening, with probably close to 70 or 80 guys grouped up at our dorm's common area, smoking cigarettes and talking about beating the living shit and messing up anyone else who was gonna pop up, and all the generic cliche stuff you say when you're pretty high on testosterone. So my amazing entourage is ready, but once party hour approaches, most of them splinter off and bail. They were more inclined to beer pong and sorority girls, which is understandable. But I am left with 15 to 20 core members in my platoon. I had decided earlier that I was not going to allow these knuckleheads to shadow me, but I could definitely use them in case of emergency. I didn't want to risk him spooking out of the meeting. So I let them know that they will need to stay inside the doors of the common area as I walked out to the meeting spot. Coleman Hall was adjacent to our connected girls' dorm, and about 300 paces outside the door to get to Coleman. So the witching hour came, and I leave the crew behind to begin the longest couple hundred or so paces of my life. My boys can see me through the glass door, but wouldn't really be able to see much once I get to Coleman Hall, about 100 paces out from my spot. That's when I noticed two things at the same time. One, some kind of small, quick movement in front of the patio walkway that goes all the way around the building. And two, the movement I was in a spot along the walkway where the only normal uber bright bulb is out. I'm not exactly sure how I was able to see him, But I suddenly realized that someone is crouched behind some bushes outside the patio perimeter, against one of those pillar buildings, in dark clothes and a hoodie. He is a few feet from the path where I am supposed to meet him, and positioned to where I really should not have been able to see him, given the pillar blocking Eddie's shadows, which I later found was smashed, blocking any shadows and the smashed light. In fact, I could have easily walked all the way to the door without even noticing that he'd have been there. I sort of jump mid-step as this happens, and I see him rise up a little, thinking I may have seen him. I see him raise up and take a few steps towards me, and fight or flight kicks in. I've learned that if I think I can deal with a situation most of the time, I'll go with fight. When it comes to something terrifying, I'll go with flight. But in the very rare, and certainly this occasion, of shit your pants terrifying, I think it's scarier to run away with having your back to whatever the thing is than just dealing with it. So I fight. And before I realize what I'm doing, I'm in a dead sprint towards this creeper, who I'm guessing sees what I can't, which is my platoon bursting through the glass door in hot pursuit. The creeper nopes out of there, running on the patio alongside Coleman Hall towards the parking lot. I can tell this isn't the mid-30s computer nerd that I predicted. The creeper is above average height and above average build, and built athletically. That's all I could tell, really. I'm not even sure he was white, because he looked a little tanned, maybe Spanish, maybe Middle Eastern. I'm not really sure. I am booking it as he turns right on a dime at the edge of the building. I realize I'm moving fast enough to catch him, but everyone else is really far behind. So I realize I'm moving so fast I won't be protected as I turn a hard right at the corner of the building. If he stops there, I'm toast. As I turn the corner, I see a van sitting alone in the parking lot in front of me. It's running and brake lights flicker on and off. It begins inching forward towards the exit. Homeslice is of course heading for the van, which for some reason sent this whole new level of fear into me. This is it. It is really happening, and I'm going to get bloody murdered. But I can't stop. Something keeps pushing me forwards. I guess I'd come this far, dealt with this crazy bullshit for almost a year now, completely unable to do anything other than try and ignore it. I'm not exactly going places academically at this point, and my life doesn't quite have all that much purpose to it yet either. If I'm going to get schwacked, I will at least know, and this crap will be over. Plus, I still have a chance to catch this madman before he gets away. If I could just get close enough to dive tackle him, I would be able to deal with it on my own. But the driver, I'm not too sure about. And it's at that moment I realise there's a third one of those miserable toads that was manning the sliding door. Great. I don't care how badass you think you are when you're a 19-year-old jock high on testosterone. Your chances of taking down 3 grown-ass men that are probably violent criminals and prepared to victimize you are not gonna happen, buddy. My turn is wide and slow due to being in a full-on sprint, and I lose ground. I'm probably 20 yards away from the lot when he does a flying leap into the side of the van. There couldn't have been any rows of seats for a leap like that. The creepster number 3 slams the sliding door shut as the van peels out the parking lot, bangs a right, and is gone in an instant. There's relief of not being kidnapped, bound and gagged in that van with three psychos who will likely have some pretty horrific plans for me. The dread is fueling inside me because I know it's still not over. I was speechless, and so was my platoon as they catch up a minute after. A few of them caught up fast enough to witness the parking lot scene. But no one was talking. The testosterone had now been replaced with genuine earnest and concern. They all just stood there with me, catching their breath and making sure that I was all right. One guy asks if anyone got a plate number. We didn't. There wasn't enough light. We finally started walking back, and I'm reliving the scene as we retrace our steps. As we get closer to the original meeting spot, I see something that scares me more than anything else in the entire equation up to this point. On the opposite side of the pillar, where Creepy McCreep person was crouching, there was a video camera, sitting on a stand pointed right at the spot I would have been standing at when I should have not been able to see him. It was still recording. The contents of the tape didn't have anything useful, just more creepiness. The recording began in the bush on the stand next to the pillar, a few minutes before the meeting time. The first couple of minutes, he was panning left and right, slowly, across the ground floor of the dorm, getting a more distant view of the building entrance that I would have taken, and a closer view of anyone approaching the mess hall. People frequently ask me, "What do you think that was all about?" After some serious and genuine thought, I came to a very unnerving conclusion. Well, two. The first is that it could have just been guys who wanted to play some kind of sick, insidious prank, or that they really genuinely wanted to hurt me for whatever reason. Maybe I'd done something to them years ago, like in high school, and they held an incredibly serious grudge. Which is weird because I don't really recall doing many bad things in high school. I was generally an okay kid, so that one is kind of hit and miss. But you never know. Some small words, some street talk can offend the most sensitive of souls. And if they're crazy, who knows what they can do. My more frightening conclusion, considering the recording, considering the preparation, considering the tracking, I honestly thought that they were planning to do some kind of snuff film. That is legitimately what I believed. The guy wanted to record everything that happened before with the calls and the tracking. He wanted to record the build-up, that I approached, completely unaware of him being there, and then they either threaten me or knock me out, get me in that van, and the fun really begins. You know, I thought that shit was just deep web stuff, and it was all a load of horse shit. But my God, I genuinely now think that I was wrong, and that I could have been in a lot more danger than I actually thought I was. For many years, I spent my summers working in a major southern US city with a moderately high crime rate and some serious racial conflict. Now, I grew up in New York City and live there to this day, and I'm not overly afraid of walking around in some of my own city's more infamous areas at night. But I think it's important to respect the city you're in. And I knew that this southern city was quite a bit more dangerous for me to walk around in alone, especially as a young petite woman. I'm 5 foot and 105 pounds. I'm pretty strong, a lot stronger than most people think by looking at me. But I know better than to think I would do well in a one-to-one fight. To be honest, in my summer city, I wouldn't even usually walk home alone after work, since I worked until 10 p.m. Even though it was only a 10-minute walk, it seemed silly to have to ask for a ride when it was a lovely and short walk through a gorgeous city. But I also knew that I didn't feel safe. It wasn't even the caution I have sometimes in a crummy neighborhood back home. It was a totally different feeling, a complete inability to be confidently safe. I loved my summers there, but I avoided being alone in the dark at all cost. But as it happens, we make little compromises. It was midnight, and the only other person in the office was staying for a few extra hours that evening. He asked me if I wanted him to drive me home, but I knew that would mean blocking the entire building up, driving 2 minutes and then 2 minutes back, and then disarming the security system again, blah blah. And I just felt silly, like a scared little girl. So I said I'd be okay, and that I only lived a few blocks away, and popped on my merry way. I walked with my head up, my stride sure, my ears open, just as I do back home. I got 1 block and then another. It was a gorgeous night, and I let myself enjoy it and relax a little bit, as I hoped in vain for a gentle breeze to cool me off a little, and enjoyed the symphony of various insects that came out at night. It was ungodly humid, and I didn't see a single other person. Definitely a different type of city than New York. But I could hear the gentle hum of nightlife from the main drag 1 avenue over. I got a 3rd block, and then I saw another person. A man. Of course, I thought to myself, as my anxiety ratcheted up, and I instantly admonished myself for my bias. I was out walking alone at night after all. Why didn't a man have the same right? But this has never happened to me before or since. Something about the sight of that man, that specific man, terrified me. I couldn't tell you why. He was in his mid-20s and had long, shaggy hair, and the moonlight reflected off him, and I could see it was blonde. Everything about him struck me as some sort of anomaly, and I don't mean to make judgments, but at that time of night, most people are in bed, or in a group, heading to some form of bar together. He looked like a surfer, not a stalker. He actually looked pretty cute, and yet I could hardly bear to look at him, because looking at him filled me with fear and apprehension. I know that you can never tell, but it really struck me how much this guy did not look like the sort of guy that would terrify me, and yet how absolutely terrified he made me feel, for reasons I couldn't articulate. There was nothing objectively scary about him, and yet I just felt this sickening dread as we slowly approached each other. It wasn't just that I was alone at night. I don't know what it was, but he scared me. He was walking towards me, and I had towards him to go home. We got closer, and he got bigger and bigger as he approached, and I felt smaller and smaller as I approached him. And get it over with. And yet, when I was about 20 inches away from him, I stopped. I don't know why. I really just didn't want to walk past him. It almost felt like I couldn't make myself go any closer. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself, and I even began to blush in the dark summer night, embarrassed by my behavior. But just to ease my mind, I crossed the street, feeling foolish. And then he crossed the street. "Don't come any closer," I said loudly, without even meaning to. It just came out of surprise. It surprised me how complete it was, how it was exactly what I felt, and exactly what I wanted most in the world at that moment, translated into words. How it was a command, not a request. Don't. I had never heard myself sound so sure of anything before in my life. Honestly, my voice was the first real sound I'd heard in several minutes, and I was surprised at how loud it felt, breaking the tension and finally starting this, whatever this was. He looked like it startled him too. "Don't be scared," he said after a moment, though he did stop walking towards me. "I'm not scared," I said. "I just don't want you near me." We stood there for a moment, at an impasse, looking at each other. "Please, I just got mugged. Someone stole my phone and wallet. I don't have any money, and I need to call someone." "There's a gas station 1 block over on that avenue. They have a phone." "I'm not from here, and I've had too much to drink and I don't want to get lost." We had the conversation, and I surprised myself with all the red flags I noticed as soon as they went up. His clear and sober sounding speech, his local sounding accent, the fact that I was the first to speak, the one to initiate the dialogue. When he is the one who needed help, you think he would have said something first. The weirdness of someone going out alone and getting drunk on their own in a strange city instead of hanging out with friends, or drinking moderately, or anything like that. I know it's not impossible. I've travelled alone myself and enjoyed my own company in plenty of bars, but it all just seemed like a bunch of relatively less than common stuff, and all taken together, it made me wary. He continued, "Will you walk to the station with me? Or can I borrow your phone?" "No. You should turn right and walk until you come to the next intersection, and you'll be at a very busy road with a gas station on your left." "Please help me," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need help." He started walking again, towards me, slowly, like how you approach a cat. "Seriously, what's wrong with you? I just need help." I thought of my Leatherman and my flick knife, both of which I use regularly for work, both of which were buried somewhere in the bottom of my hellishly messy purse. My fingers twitched with longing, but I didn't want to be distracted, so I didn't fumble around for them. "I told you, don't come closer." I stepped backwards and hated myself for doing it. It felt like a sort of mini surrender, and he took another step forwards. "I won't hurt you." I began crossing the empty street, walking backwards at first just to keep my eye on him, and I said, "I'll scream. There's a cop who's stationed on a bike 4 blocks away. He's there every night, and he will hear me scream, and he'll be here in seconds. You really should turn right at the corner. It will take you directly to the gas station." "If you say so," he said. And I felt the distinct and chilling question within myself. of whether, in his ambiguity, he was referring to the location of the gas station or the location of the police station. He didn't start walking. I stood there, on the other side of the street, wary to take my eyes off him. But he didn't start walking. So I did. I walked until we were directly across the street from each other. And then I walked further. I glanced at him over my shoulder after a few steps, and he was still there watching me, going nowhere, just watching. I walked a few more steps and glanced over my shoulder at him again. He was still standing there. I quickly picked up the pace and went further away. Looking back, he was gone. Completely gone. He must have moved quickly, a lot quicker than he'd been moving before, when he was walking towards me anyway, to reach the intersection and turn right towards the gas station in just those few stops. I couldn't stop wondering where else he could have gone, moving that quickly without me watching. I didn't think he could have crossed the whole street and managed to hide somewhere, at least not without me hearing. I glanced at the sidewalk across from me, and it was lined with trees and bushes. There were massive gardens all along it, all kinds of yards and stuff like that. There were almost no streetlights, and so many shadows. He could have been anywhere. I thought about turning down a side street and heading towards the main drag where all the bars and restaurants were. I glanced down one as I passed. No streetlights at all. Just sleepy, silent buildings all empty for the night, and the bright lights of the next avenue seemed impossibly far away. I kept going straight and tried to tell myself to calm down. He was just someone out walking alone, just like me, nothing more. I even managed to work up some guilt over not doing more to help him. I like to think myself as a good person, and it bothered me that I had been so rude to someone who may have actually needed help, but at the same time, I couldn't quite relax about it. I wanted to run. I wanted to run desperately. Maybe it was just the leftover superstition from childhood, but somehow I felt like the chase never truly began until you started running. So I walked quickly. I looked back and I saw shadows. So many shadows. I walked faster. I looked back. Nothing but shadows. I would myself to calm, but it wouldn't happen. Finally, I approached the block where the cop on the motorcycle was always waiting behind a tree. With that grove in sight, I broke into a run. The chase was finally on, if it ever would be. I sprinted, and then the panic grew as I pushed even faster down that block. The cop heard me running his way, and he saw me and asked if I was okay. He asked as I approached him, still largely shrouded by the shadows of the trees around him, straddling his bike peering out at me. "Yes," I replied, feeling silly immediately. "I'm fine, sorry, I just got scared." I smiled an apology and began to make fun of myself, the way we often do when we feel stupid. But the cop was already looking behind me over my shoulder. "Sir?" he called loudly, finally coming out of the shadows so he could be seen. "Can I help you with anything?" "No thanks," I heard a voice say. I turned around. The man maybe 30 feet behind me, just staring, looking. I can only think that he followed me after all, slinking along in the shadows, that he walked when I walked, and eventually he ran when I ran to keep up, even though running on full meant abandoning his cover. "Do you know him?" the cop asked. "No," I said quietly. "He told me he got mugged, and he wanted me to help him. But I was scared, so I didn't. I didn't help him. Even in that moment, I felt a twinge of guilt. I waited for the man to come closer, to tell the cop he'd been mugged, to tell him he needed a phone, to prove that I was the horrible person in the situation, not him. He said nothing. He waved and turned and started walking the other way. He didn't look back. I waited with the police officer, and we walked with him for several minutes, and then I asked the cop to escort me back home a block away. When we got to my front door, the cop asked me if I was okay or if I wanted to make a formal statement. I couldn't really think of anything to say. I was out walking alone and saw another person out walking alone, and I yelled at him when he asked for help. And then he followed me, and I didn't really know if he was blonde. I was still a bit shocked and stunned, so I said no and thanked him for his help, and made my way home. I went inside and used my flashlight to go to bed, too scared to turn on the lights for fear that they would render me visible from the street. It wasn't until I was already laying down, sweltering in my unair-conditioned bedroom because I couldn't bear to open the windows, that I found myself wondering, if I hadn't have ran, if he had been forced to run and thus abandoned the silent but even cover of the shadows and trees, would the police officer have seen him at all? Or would he have remained hidden, watching me, following me right up to my very doorstep, lurking in my own bushes as I climbed the stairs to the porch and fought the key in the door lock? Would I have waved to the cop bravely, speed walking my way home, willing myself not to run, with that man slithering behind me the whole time, unseen by either of us? And if so, what then? I still don't know exactly why it happened, but I'll just start nonetheless. I was visiting my mother in Montebello, another small city in Los Angeles County. Honestly, I never liked being there because my mum and I got into a lot of fights, and was the main reason I lived with my father. I'm going to be straight with you. I wasn't a great son, nor brother. It's the reason I was homeless and went through a lot of shit. I had to learn what I refused to from my parents. But anyway, I digress. It was the summer of my sophomore year of high school, going into my junior year. I had many friends, but lost touch with most since I moved to my father's house. I was just sitting on the stairs that led up to my mum's apartment, and my mother made me watch my two younger sisters as they played with the other kids from my mum's apartment and neighbouring ours. As it was getting late, around about 8 or 9 p.m, my mum started calling me and my sisters back inside. One of them was running around playing some games, causing me to run after her until she got tired. The other one, who is a year older, was talking to her friend April, and this young guy I had never seen before. My mother had been living in that apartment complex for 6 years now, so it was strange to me that I had never seen him before. As I walk my younger sister inside, I tell my other sister that my mum said that we had to go back in. She just ignored me as I walk past to the stairs, making sure that the youngest actually went inside. She used to be rebellious like me growing up. Right when my younger sister got inside, I turned around to get the other one. She was miles deep in a conversation with April and the other guy. I was a bit rude and told her straight up that she needed to get inside. Who the hell was this guy anyway? As I looked towards the guy, She giggled and just told me it was April's friend, Joel. So she resumes her conversation, and they're talking about the paranormal. April was telling my sister that she had a little boy in her apartment, and my sister telling April about the old man in my mother's, which was actually true. At that point, their conversation piqued my interest. At first I was just listening, but then I started questioning them, because I wanted to make sure that their story didn't have any holes. At the time, it seemed to me that they were indeed telling me true events. I wasn't really creeped out by their stories, to be honest, only because I've seen and been through things that I can't even explain to this day. Well, that was until I asked the random guy, John, what was the scariest thing he had ever experienced. And this is what he told me. That after his grandpa died, he'd been followed by a shadow man, and that had been going on since he turned 7. He always thought it could be his grandfather, so he didn't really mind. That is until he got to the age of 11. This shadow would break things and felt more negative. He would say this shadow would pick him up from his bed and smash him back down, waking him and his grandma, who slept in another room. The whole time he was telling us this, I could hear his voice cracked and his eyes beginning to water up. I began to feel a chill run up and down my spine as he said the next thing. Sometimes I still see it. I was standing right in front of him, staring at him, and from the corner of my eye on the left side of him, a huge black mass rose out of nowhere. I couldn't even see through this thing. I'm guessing my face dropped or something, because the thing I heard him say was, "You saw him, huh?" I don't know what I saw. I can't explain it. I just shuddered. I saw something rising from the floor behind you. He actually brightened up and said, "Finally, someone else saw it." I told him I believed him before I actually saw it though. He tried to look behind me, like if something ran behind me and he tried to follow. This is where I begin freaking out and asked him, "You okay, dude?" He just looks puzzled and says, "Oh, nothing. I just thought I saw your little sister behind you wearing a little black dress." I looked at him even more confused, and I told him that she was already inside with my mother. I asked him to describe the girl he saw, and I shit you not, this guy literally said she had blonde long hair, really light skin, and wore a dress, and was as tall as my youngest sister, and was just staring at the floor. If you guys don't know why this creeped me out, I'll tell you. It's because my older sister and I both had an incident with a spirit girl that looked exactly as she described. I was speechless, and my eyes were watering. The only reason I believed what he told me was true was because my older sister and I never told a soul about what we had experienced, and I still get the chills remembering that day. I never had an incident with the girl ever again, but my father's side of the family always believed my baby brother, who had a couple of disabilities, played with her all the years we lived in that house in Whittier. I tend to wonder at times who she was and if she still is at that house. I guess I'll never know. I'm not willing to see if she'll follow me somewhere else. I was kind of scared to be in my room the next couple of days, since I had to sleep in that room alone. I wish I could say I've slept somewhere else in the house, but my father wasn't too nice and would get mad whenever I tried to sleep anywhere but my own room. I didn't want to tell him the truth, why I didn't want to be in there, because he never liked talking about the paranormal or spiritual stuff. So, I was forced to remain in that cursed room, scared that one day that girl may come again. It was quiet in my house. Well, quiet in a paranormal sense for a few weeks. I eventually forgot about the pictures that I took that night the fear possessed me, and I was in my father and stepmother's room watching Paranormal State when they were in the front room watching a movie with my uncle and baby brother. It was an intense episode, so my eyes were glued to the screen until a commercial came on. I went to grab my phone and noticed I left it in my room down the hall. I'm going to have to try and explain to you what the route looks like. If you walk out my father's room, on the left side is the living room, and on the right is the hallway closet. As you walk down the hall and get to the end, to the left side would be my room. Forward would be my older sister's room, and on the right is the bathroom. So I went down the hall, went into my room, and got my phone. As I grab it, I turn on the screen to see if I have any messages. There was nothing, so I start walking back to my father's room. As I get to the hallway, I see a figure of a girl right in front of the hall closet door. I just assumed it was my younger sister. It was around her height of 4'8", so I walk past the figure and try to put my hand on her head, to be a mean brother and push her out the way. My hand just fell through, like the figure wasn't even there. I was scared shitless, and I turned to see the figure, but nothing was there. My father saw me, just standing there frozen in place, and said to me, "Is there something wrong, boy?" I shook my head and asked where Isabel was, and he told me that she was still at my mother's house. So I started watching TV again, shaken and breathless. I kept looking in the hallway to make sure that nobody was out there. I eventually tell my older sister that I believe there is something in the house, because she used to like watching paranormal shows and stuff with me. She started to tell me an incident that happened to her a month before. She said that one day she came home from work and just fell asleep on her bed, and after a while she started to hear someone crying and calling her name. She thought it was my younger sister and asked her what was wrong. The crying continued, and my sister got annoyed, got up, and went to yell when she noticed that no one was there. So she walked around the room to see where my sister would be, and then around the house, and finds no one. She got so scared that she left to her boyfriend's house and waited until my father got home. When she told me this story, I got chills. I told her what I saw and showed her the pictures I took. It goes without saying, we both believed that there was a spirit in our house. Last December, the engine in my POS car started knocking, and eventually gave out, as well as the transmission. Seeing as it would be more expensive to fix it than it would be to buy a new car, I scrapped it for a few $100 and put the word out that I was looking to buy a car in between $2,000 to $2,500. I was, and still do, work 2 jobs, so I very quickly tired of having bum rides to work. This fact led me to ignore a few red flags, but I'll get to that. One of my jobs is a corporate 9 to 5. The other is an upscale gentleman's club. I put the word out about needing a car to my co-workers at both places. A month went by, and I hadn't heard a thing, when a waitress at the club pulled me aside. She told me that one of her customers offered her a really good deal on a car, but her parents bought her a brand new Escape, so she didn't need it. He wanted $1,000 for an '06 Chevy with low mileage, and asked if I wanted to be introduced. It seemed like a godsend. I quickly agreed, and she led me over to the back of the bar, to a booth where a tall, broad-shouldered older man sat. He looked about 60 years old, but he was still pretty huge even sitting down. He looked like a retired army guy, with a small beer gut, but lots of old man muscle. Mark, this is Carrie. Carrie, this is Mark. She introduced us, and I sat down next to him. He didn't look at me or acknowledge me, and I got the feeling he was very awkward. My co-worker excused herself and left us. I quickly explained that I was looking for a new car. He finally looked at me, and he began explaining the deal. It was his brother's wife's car. They lived one state over, about 4 hours. They initially bought the car for their daughter, brand new, but she had a baby a few years later and refused to drive it anymore because it was a 2-door and the baby's car seat didn't fit behind the seat. It had been sitting for years, but now the neighbor, who was a cop, was threatening them, saying that if they didn't put insurance in it, they had to get rid of it, or they'd be ticketed. So now they were looking to unload it as quickly as possible, hence the great deal. I was beyond excited. Mark and I chatted a little longer, albeit awkwardly, and eventually exchanged numbers. Before I went to work, the subject of art came up, and he mentioned he had always wanted to learn how to draw. I got excited, because at the time I was giving private drawing lessons to make extra money. He seemed interested, and after I showed him my portfolio on my phone, and he suggests maybe even knocking the price down a little in exchange for a few lessons, I wrap up our goodbyes and head back to work. He exits my work shortly after. I am ecstatic. At 3 a.m, I'm finally back in civilian clothes, waiting inside the front doors for my ride when Mark texts me. Can you come to my house for the drawing lessons this week? I politely tell him that I didn't feel comfortable with that, because he would have to pick me up and I'd be dependent on him to take me home. And he's a stranger. It just didn't feel right. All the more reason for you to get this car. You deserve it, he replied. I agree, brushing off the second half of the sentence. He's probably just a little lonely and trying to be nice. We set a date and meet up in a public space, so I can check out the car. He plans on paying his niece to make the 4-hour drive the following Tuesday, 5 days from now. I agree. She doesn't mind because her parents are going to let her keep whatever money I pay for it, and Mark will pay for her gas there and back, plus a tip. I forget about Mark for a day or two, until the texts start. All hours of the day, the most random questions, but all of them pertaining to the car and art deals. So I didn't think too much into it. He's never been married, and he claims he has Asperger's, which I found out later was a lie, and that he only has his brother, no one else. I figure he's doing me a favor, and I can answer a few harmless texts. But then, I miss a few at work, and he spams me, getting progressively angrier with each text. When I finally respond, I bitch him out, saying he has no right to my time or attention. He relents, saying he thought something bad had happened to me, that's all, and that he wasn't angry. He was scared. I think back to what he said about having Asperger's, and I think maybe I'm misunderstanding his texts, and I kind of feel bad. He stops for a few days, and then Tuesday rolls around. I bring my mum's boyfriend with me to the parking lot as I'm meeting him, and look for the car and his niece. It's beautiful. I love it. My mum's boyfriend says it's a great deal, and that I would be stupid not to take it. I tell Mark I want it, and he spent the whole interaction silent, seemingly intimidated by my mum's 5'1" boyfriend, which is hilarious. The niece drives the car back home. Because the title in his sister-in-law's name, I have to go to her house 4 hours away to have her sign the title over to me. Mark says he has a doctor's appointment at the hospital about 30 minutes from there, so I can ride down there with him and drive myself home. I agree to the seemingly convenient plan, and we set the date for next Wednesday. So, come Wednesday morning at 6 AM, my mum drops me to Mark's house. I assume his appointment is at 9 or 10, since he wants to leave very early. But he tells me it's at 1. I ask him why the hell he's leaving so early, if the hospital is only 3.5 hours away. He ignores my question, but I have my answer soon enough. This neurotic arsehat has to stop at every rest stop. Every single one. It takes us 6 hours to get to the hospital, almost making us late for his appointment. We park the car and I tell him to ask one of the concierge people where we're supposed to be, as it's a huge hospital. He then screams a racial slur. He's getting frantic, and I'm starting to see how he's a little unhinged. But I'm 3 hours from home and he's already got my $1,000. I can't back up now. I ask for directions to find the elevator to the floor we need to be on. It's the 8th floor. Mark won't get in. He says he can't do elevators. They'd kill him. Randomly, a mentally handicapped man in a wheelchair next to us repeats the words, "It will kill us." And Mark yells, "See? He knows!" I'm out of patience. I yank him into the elevator and we finally arrive at his appointment. Just on time. I quickly fall asleep in the lobby because he would not let me fall asleep in the car, knowing I'd worked till 3 AM the night before. I awaken to the sound of Mark screaming at the top of his lungs at the poor clerk behind the desk in the lobby. He's calling her every name in the book: skank, whore, slut, bitch, asshole, and so on. She looks completely terrified, as can be reasonably expected, and screams back that she is calling security. I hop up, grab him by the arm and drag him, literally running back to the elevator. He opens his mouth to protest, but I tell him to shut up and get in the elevator. I am in no mood for this. I refused to be stranded across state lines because he had landed himself in the slammer for God knows what reason. We exit the elevator just as a team of security guards enter it and rush past them, trying to look normal. We finally get outside and I lose my shit and ask what the hell happened. He told me he was waiting for the doctor and he had to use the bathroom. He came to his room while he was gone, so he skipped him to go to the next patient, and he wouldn't be back for an hour. And I ask what the receptionist has to do with it. And he says that she was in on it, and that she could have told him that the doctor was an arsehole. I just stare at him in disbelief. I fully realize I am dealing with a mentally unstable individual, but I am locked into this deal and I'm 30 minutes from being able to drive away. So I just shake my head and walk back to the car silently. We finally get to the brother's house. The title is signed over to me. All is good, except that the port in the car to charge my phone doesn't work. And now with my phone being dead, I don't know how to get home. I asked Mark if I can charge my phone in his car for a while, and he says yes. I start to follow him home. It's getting really late at this point, and I'm exhausted, and I beg him please skip a few rest stops. He skips 2, then pulls into a rest area. He hops out of his car with his childish grin, and he says, "You like what I did there? I skipped 2. Oh my Christ. I check my phone and it's on 50%. Good enough. I am done with this guy. I tell him goodbye and thanks, but I'm gonna take off now. And he seems confused. I ignore it and absolutely floor it home. Then the texts begin. Zoom zoom, little girl. Let's see if you find the secret of the wire. You won't make it far, little girl. Zoom. There she goes. And creep the hell out. But I ignore it as soon as the SOS is open. I have registration and insurance on the car. The texts start to get worse. Tell your pimp you messed up, little girl. And I have all the money. Don't ignore me. You think the car is safe? Ha! Silly little girl. You're just a whore junkie. Wait till I go to the cops. You stole that car, and you owe me $2,000. I'm talking to your pimp now, because you're too stupid to come up with that kind of cash. Bring it to me on Monday, or I'm going to the cops and bust your little sex trafficking ring. Variations on this, all day. I block his number. I call Mark's brother just in case, and tell him what's happening. He couldn't care less. He says to pay him, and I say I did. He says, do I have proof? And I say yes. He gave you the money. Why would your wife sign over the title without getting paid? He asks me if Mark knows where I live. I say no, and he just says, good. I start to get texts from a new number, this time claiming to be the cops. I know it's Mark, and I threaten to get a PPO if he doesn't stop. He goes ballistic. He tells me he knows where I live, where my kids go to school, and where I get my drugs. And I know he's lying, because I don't have kids, a pimp, or a drug problem, and I'm not a prostitute. I'm scared shitless, and all I can do is block this number too. I'm always looking over my shoulder leaving work. I sleep with a baseball bat. He attempts to get me fired from my job, but he's laughed out and banned. Months go by, and I start to relax. I can still see if he texts me, even though he's blocked. It just goes to a different folder. I check it once in a while, and for a few months, he sends me completely normal texts, followed by psycho shit when I don't respond. I know you love me, and that's why you're doing this. Because your dad is dead, And so you don't know how to love. It hurts me. Let me buy your kids some toys. It jumps from that to, you whore, zoom zoom. Do you like to ruin men's lives? Stop listening to your meth head brother. Again, I have no kids. I realize he's trying to scare me, and legally, the car is mine. He can't take it from me. I finally relax a little. Then, I happen to be awake one day when the mail lady comes. She knocks and tells me I have to sign for something. She hands me a manila envelope with the name Mark Smith as the return address, my full name on it, and the back is stamped with notify sender stamps, like 100 of them, and erratically placed. My heart stops. He knows where I live. And as much as I'm dying to know what the letter says, I don't sign for it and tell her to return it to sender and explain the situation. Now I realize he probably just looked up my name online and he found 5 different addresses, then sent certified mail to all of them in my name in an attempt to verify at which one I lived. I thwarted his plan by not signing. Screw him. Fast forward 2 months. I am home alone and get a call from a number that I don't know. But it's local, so I picked up. Hi, this is Officer Sanford with the City Fraud Division. Is this Carrie? Oh shit. Yeah, that's me. I believe we have a mutual friend here. My heart sinks. I know he means Mark. Am I screwed? Oh, don't worry, girl, I'm on your side. I think this guy is off his rocker. I've been looking into this for a while, and this just doesn't add up to you being guilty of anything but buying a car. Justice. Turns out, Mark walked into a police station to report the car that he never owned, that I had the title to. He reported it stolen, and to report my prostitution ring. He was laughed out, so he wrote letters, lots of them, to the government, to the president, to the sheriff. So a city fraud investigator got involved. He spoke to the sister-in-law and verified she signed the title over, verified I had registration and insurance, looked into my squeaky clean record, and even looked into my schooling and saw very prestigious university. And he spoke to Mark face to face. And he knew Mark was absolutely mental. So he had me write a brief account of my side of the story and advised me to get a restraining order, and told Mark to stay away from me. Me, as well as the brother and sister-in-law actually, and close the case. If Mark ever tries to mess with me again, I've got Officer Sanford's number on speed dial. I am just so relieved that the stalking came to an end. For now anyway. This particular story haunts me to this day, and 20 years have passed since it happened. I was around 21 when this occurred. I was in the military at Fort Sill and didn't know it, but Desert Storm was right around the corner. At the time, I lived in south central Oklahoma, on the outskirts of a small town called Duncan. I was helping a friend round up some cattle that got out because someone had run across a T-section and went through their fence. It tore 2 posts down and left a 30-foot section open for the cattle to just escape from. We already found most of the cattle and were missing another 3 or 4, so we were out until 1 AM on dirt bikes trying to find them before someone hit them and sued his father. My friend and I went east and the other guys went north and south. One thing you need to understand about Oklahoma is that most of it is either farmed by either cattle or crops, and it is also divided into 1 mile sections for the most part. In other words, the roads all run north, south, or east and west, and intersect at 1 mile intervals. If you ask for directions for something out in the country, you're more likely than not to be instructed to go 3 miles north and then 2 miles west. The area at the time was sparse and there weren't many homes. We didn't know how long the hole had been in the fence. My friend's father only checked the fence because he was missing livestock. They owned the entire mile section and a good portion of the adjoining mile. The hole in the fence was on the east side of their land, at the furthest distance from their house. They checked the fence for such holes on a weekly basis. So the hole could not have been more than a day or two old. James and I were riding on these old dusty dirt bikes with battery-powered spotlights to both show the way and to search for cattle. We'd stop at any of the million small wooden bridges and look over to see if there were any cows down by the water. Our plan was to go out 10 miles and then go over a mile section and drive back 10 times until we'd covered a total of 10 miles. Then we would do it all again, but on the north and south roads instead of the east and west roads. If you were to plot a map, it would just be a 10 by 10 grid. We had been at it since before 9 PM, just as it was getting dark, and we'd already gone 10 miles out and about 3 miles over. I need to mention at this point that there are some mile sections that are not divided by roads, and you have to turn one way or another at a T intersection. If that happens, we always took the road that went in our general direction of travel. If we were travelling east and came to a T, we'd already checked the road north of us. Then we head to the south, a mile and then east again. Occasionally, an old farmer would pass away and leave his land to relatives who had no interest in farming, and the land would be put up for sale or just left alone for years. When this happens and the roads aren't used as much, nature reclaims them and you're usually left with a dirt road with weeds and grass going on it. Or you're left with a little more than an improved trail, usually 2 ruts with overgrown reeds and Johnson grass and occasionally a tree. We were on one of the rutted roads, heading south to the next intersection where we would turn east again. The land here was too hilly for cultivation and had been left alone for at least the last 30 years. We were both familiar with it, and we hunted and fished there. This mile section and the next 2 were basically wild, and at the end of the dirt trail would be a T intersection. But the west side was fenced and the only option was to turn east again. And, at the end of this mile, the road would just be a dead end, but we had to check it and then double back. We just made the turn back to the east when we saw something burning over the next rise. Grass fires are extremely dangerous and can get out of control in minutes. As we topped the rise, we saw the fire was actually in the middle of the dirt road. When we got to it, we found that it was a recliner that was burning. A blue lazy boy recliner. We stopped and threw some dirt on it and finally got it extinguished. James and I were wondering what kind of idiot would do this, and how strange it was to be just in the middle of the road on fire. Satisfied that it was no longer burning, we got back on our bikes and idled past the recliner towards the end of the mild section. Still, a quarter of the mile in the distance. We found one of their cows at the bottom of the rise, about 100 feet down from the road. It was laying half in and half out of the road. Its throat had been cut and was laying there with its eyes opened and tongue hanging out. There was blood everywhere. We were looking to try and figure out what happened, and James said, "Hey, look at this," and showed me where the blood had dripped from the cow to about 10 feet away from it. There were shoe prints of blood in the road. It was just part of a shoe print, but you could tell that it was a shoe print, and we found 2 more when we looked more diligently. At this point, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and it was suddenly a very cool evening. I looked at James, and his eyes were as big as saucers. He thought something spooky was happening too. We talked about going back, but we knew that we would be shamed if we didn't see if there was anything else. We finally decided to walk the bikes the rest of the way to the dead end, just in case there was someone there. We didn't want them to hear our engines. We began walking the last quarter of the mile or so to the dead end. It was at the base of the last hill, and we just started heading up on the other side. My heart was going about 200 miles an hour, and I had gotten cottonmouth so bad that it was almost impossible to swallow. Then I noticed that someone had stuck paper plates on the barbs of the wires of the fence. We looked, and there were plates stuck to the top strands of where the wire on both sides of the road. It started about 50 feet behind us and continued up and over the hill. They were evenly spaced about 5 feet apart, and as our gaze followed the row of paper plates up to the top of the hill, James suddenly said, "There's another fire." And it was that moment that I could smell it. But what I smelt wasn't a normal smoky smell. It was as though someone had added incense to it. I asked James if he could smell it. I told him I didn't like it at all. I was okay with losing face in front of our friends and his dad and brothers, and I was ready to go. He agreed with me, but said that we had to see what was burning. We were both whispering, and both so shaky that our voices quivered. We started up the hill again, and I was thinking, with every step, that we were going to be seriously killed or worse. As we got to the top of the hill, one of the paper plates blew off the fence and skittered behind us, making both of us jump, and we dared not scream. After we saw that, we laughed it off, but James shushed me and told me to listen. We could hear voices. As we topped the hill and were able to see the bottom where the road stopped, we saw a group of about 10 people, all standing around another recliner that was burning. They had their backs to us and were passing a big picture around. From our vantage point, we couldn't actually see what was in the picture, but the slit throat of the cow haunted my thoughts. They would each take a mouthful and spit the thing into the fire. This went on until the pitcher was empty. The entire time they were all saying something in unison. We could only understand an occasional word. They changed their tone in a rhythmic manner, with an emphasis on the last word, and I can remember hearing "here and there" and "beseech" and "father." James and I stood there on the top of the hill like a couple of idiots, our mouths hanging wide open and actually scared stiff. After a minute or two, they would repeat whatever it was, all the while passing that pitcher and spitting into the fire. There was a small camp table set up on the side and a little behind them. After the last of the liquid was gone, a man turned and sat the picture on the table and picked up what appeared to be a large loaf of bread. Just as he was turning back to the fire, he evidently saw us. I am sure that we made a nice silhouette, sitting there at the top of the hill. He screamed, "Hey!" and dropped the loaf of bread and started running in our direction. The others turned and immediately followed. That was all the encouragement that we needed. It was time to go. We turned our bikes around and James got his started on the first knock. But I somehow managed to get myself off balance, and when I kicked, the bike fell on its side with me. By this time I was in near panic and was breathing in raspy, short breaths. I picked up the bike again and tried to start it, but it didn't start. I thought about running, but we were in the middle of nowhere. I finally started pushing the motorcycle down the other side of the hill and jumped on it. It seemed like it took forever to get enough speed, but I popped the clutch and it started. James was waiting at the corner of the intersection to make sure that I was coming, and we headed for his house. Going way too fast for safety, especially in the dark. When we finally got back to his house, we told his dad what we had seen. His dad called a couple of friends, and they all loaded up their trucks with enough weapons to start a small war. James and I sat with his dad and told him where they were. His dad kept asking questions on that way, as in what they were doing, and why the chair was on fire, why they cut the cow's throat, how many were there, what they looked like and what they were driving. The last question stumped us. We hadn't seen any cars or trucks. The road was the only way in or out, and there was a creek that ran on the back side of the end of that particular road, so they couldn't have gone in that direction. How had they gotten there with two recliners? When we got to the last stretch of road, the headlights found the spot where the recliner had been sitting. It was gone. We could all see where the road and surrounding grass was burnt, but the recliner was not there. As we got closer, we noticed that the cow was gone as well. I hate to admit it, but I was getting scared all over again. I was afraid that his dad would tell us that it was in our imagination and not believe us. But when we got closer to the burnt spot, James's dad noticed the chair off in the ditch on the side of the road. Then I noticed the cow on the other. It was also in the ditch. The paper plates were all gone. Buster got out to look at the cow with the other men. They stood there talking and shaking their head for what seemed like 10 minutes before getting back in the truck. We continued towards the hill. The ruts made by the spinning motorcycle tires were easily seen, but there was no fire on the other side of the hill. We all went down where the other recliner had been burning. It and the camp table were gone. You could see where someone had walked around the charred area and covered it in dirt. And after we left, James saw a paper plate about 50 feet on the other side of the fence. James's dad called the county sheriff when we got home, and by that time it was daylight, and we went out again with the sheriff and a deputy. When we got back to the road, the first recliner and the cow were gone, but you could still see where something had been on fire, and there was still blood on the road and grass. James showed them the shoe prints we'd seen. At the bottom of the hill, you could still see the charred area where the second recliner had been burning, and the deputy found a little scuff mark where the table had been sitting. At the other end of the road, you could see where the top strand of the fence had been tugged down and wrapped around by the lower strand, so someone could crawl over it. You could also see where the grass and weeds had been trampled, providing a fairly easy trail to follow. We found a woman's tennis shoe on the other side of the creek. You could see where someone had climbed up that bank on the far side of the creek. We followed the trail all the way across the field to the next dirt road. Again, the top wire was wrapped around the next lower wire, and there was a piece of red bandana-looking material caught in it. There were marks on the road where 2 or 3 different cars had spun their tires when they left. Buster also found a large piece of glass that had blood on it. James's dad filed a report for the missing cow. They found 4 more cows in the opposite direction from where me and James had gone. They never found the recliners or the missing cow. The sheriff called a few days later and told James's dad that the blood on the grass was human and not bovine. It was his guess that the pitcher broke and someone cut their hand whilst carrying it back to the vehicle. 2 weeks after that, there was a huge scare in our community about some cult that had promised the area at large that they were going to sacrifice a blonde-haired virgin girl and boy. James's dad said that it was just someone running their mouth after hearing about the incident. It was all anyone talked about that summer. James's dad also said that he sure would like to know what happened to that cow. So I am a paramedic, and I get to deal with what people call the fun ones, meaning they hate you a lot and don't want your help even though they could have a knife sticking out of them. So I had to deal with this one girl who would decide to run away from home because she didn't like her living situation. I would often have to come out to her house and do what we call a wellness check to make sure everyone was accounted for and wasn't in any kind of distress. It was just another day at work, and surprise, surprise, we got a call over the radio saying, "Medic 42, please respond to a call at insert girl's address here for seizure-like activity." This wasn't uncommon, because this girl had seizures, something fierce, and didn't know how to handle them very well. So that's when we would get called out to assist her. I looked at my partner, who was already getting up, and I said, "Let me guess. Oxygen support is when we give someone oxygen to help them depending on what kind of distress they are in." We were only about a 4-minute drive away from her house, since she lived around the corner, and when we got to her house, we saw the police were already there, and one of the officers walked up to me and said she was gone and nobody knew where she was. This was odd, because she had just sent the police a message saying for us to come out, not 5 minutes ago. The officer told us that we needed to get out and look for her, since she was a risk to herself. You know, one of those kind of people who shouldn't be left alone for too long. I wasn't too happy to have to run around the door for someone who wasn't even there. I told the officer that we would look for her, even though I didn't want to, since there was so many better things that we could be doing. I told my partner that she couldn't have gone far if she was messaging us. She had left her phone at the house. So we set out and started searching for her. We looked up and down the side streets, and after about 10 minutes of looking, we couldn't find her. So we decided to alert other medics in the area to be on lookout for this girl. I thought for sure we were going to find her soon, since she's pretty famous in our small town and everyone knew her very well. That night came and gone, and we still couldn't find her. It was our turn to come back on shift, and we were still searching for her. But something in my head was telling me that we wouldn't find her alive. The thought that made me cringe, because dead people are not something that I like to deal with. I also knew that we have bears around here, and it's spring, so they would have been coming out by this time. I've responded to bear attacks before, and let me tell you, there is nothing fun about a bear attack. Trust me. A few days later, we get a call saying she was found, but she was badly hurt. Of course, we got up and quickly set out code 3 for where she was, since it was only about 20 minutes away. Let me mention that I am a specialized paramedic who deals with more complicated situations, so this was my area of training. We get there, and she was in the woods, so we had to take a cart to get her, because I was told she was in a creek somewhere in the woods. When we got to her, I thought, damn, how is she still alive? Her face was all torn up, and she had lost a lot of blood, to the point where she looked like a sheet of paper. We worked quickly to get her on a spine board and up to our ambulance so that we could transport her, since the hospital was now an hour away, and I wasn't sure if she was going to make it or not. On the way up, we managed to get lost in the woods, and let me say carrying a 100-pound girl plus 30 pounds of respiratory stuff up an incline is hard, so the process was slow. Once we managed not to get lost, we were able to quickly make our way back up to the ambulance. We set off to the hospital, and I told my partner that I needed him in the back to help me, since I needed to start an IV and keep her stable. She started to come around once we gave her some fluids, to the point that she was able to talk to us. We had to push a lot of fluid into her since she was overheated, and it was about 80 degrees out in North Carolina. I started asking her if she knew her name, and did she know which year it was. She responded correctly to both of them. That's when I asked her what made her run away, and she came back with something I wasn't expecting. She said Topaz made her do it. She then began to explain to me what that was, and I looked at her the whole time like, okay, I'm just going to agree with whatever you say to make you happy. She begins to tell me that her Topaz made her run away from home and jump off a bridge into a creek to hopefully kill herself, so then she could be with her one true love, the devil. I just kept looking at her and wondering to myself, is this girl human? All of a sudden, she tries to grab me and throw me in the front. I hit my head on the side, and my partner, who was back with me, tried to restrain her. I got up and tried to help, but it was like she was magic, and no matter how much force we used to get her back on the stretchers, she was somehow stronger than both of us. We knew we had to be careful, because she was already hurt, and we didn't want to hurt her more. The struggle didn't last longer than about 30 seconds, but still it felt like hours, because she was physically hurting us with her punching. We arrived to the hospital, and I was so happy to get her out of our care, because she was kind of creeping my partner and I out. As I was making the report, all of a sudden, this girl comes out and started destroying the ward. She even took out her IV and started pointing it at people. Of course, she was restrained by security, which took about 7 or 10 of them to take her back into the room where she was restrained to her bed. By this time, I was more than ready to get out of there and get back on the road to another call, because this girl was freaking me out a lot. I did wonder if I would see her again, because that was the third time in a row I saw her that month. Of course, I got my answer 2 weeks later. I had just started my shift when I got a call saying to respond to her house. Of course. I didn't want to take it because she was the last thing I wanted to see again. We pulled up and there were no cars in the driveway, and the police were not there yet. I told my partner to get out stuff and be on alert for anything. I knew my partner and I could take her down if we had to. Since my partner John is about 170 pounds and 6'2", and we were dealing with a 70 pound 5'5" chick. We knocked on the door and there was no answer. Our dispatcher told us she said to break down the door. So I had my partner kick in the door. I knew where her room was, so I rushed up there and found her lying face down on the floor, ashen white. I knew we had to act fast and forget about what happened before, because this was something different. I took her vitals and they were not remotely normal, very slow, and soon the cops showed up and they contacted her parents while we quickly checked her out and got her loaded into the ambulance. I was still a bit scared because I didn't want a repeat of the last time, since I got hurt last time and had a dislocated jaw. On the way to the hospital, she was a lot nicer and telling me about her life, about how stressful it was. I decided to ask her what happened the other week and what made her want to hurt my partner and I. She looked at me like I was crazy and said that she didn't remember it at all. All she knew was 1 second she was at home and the next she was at the hospital. I thought to myself, okay, that's weird. And then she gives me a look of true murder on her face, and I ask if she's okay. She starts crying and crying until she was almost screaming. I tried to comfort her, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get her to stop. It went on like that until we got to the hospital, and that's when the nurses took over her care. About a month went by and I didn't get any calls to her house. But one day, I got someone who wanted to speak to me about something. I wondered who it could be, because it was rare for that to happen. I walked out into our main office waiting room and saw the girl was standing there. She looked a lot better. She didn't have her long messy hair. It was cut short and well kept. I asked her what I could do for her, and she told me she wanted to say sorry and thank me for helping her, even though she was so difficult. She went on to say she had a medical condition that made it where her brain swells and it will cause her to go dumb, since things in her brain aren't working correctly. She started to cry, and I gave her a hug telling her it was okay and it was my job to take care of her. Now, when I get people who are mean to me, I think that maybe they have some medical issues unknown. So, I don't judge by the way they act. About 3 months go by, and I continue to work as normal. When it becomes time for bed, since sometimes we get to sleep, I have the night shift at this point, because every other month I do the night shift from 7 PM to 6 AM. Around 5 AM, our dispatcher radios in and says there's a girl running around on the highway and we needed to come check her out, since police didn't know what to do other than to call us. My partner John and I, along with Medic 12, went with us because we didn't know what was going to happen. You never know with these kind of calls. We started out since it was only a mile away from where we pulled up. And I saw a girl who I noticed had gotten pepper sprayed and was crying on the curb with the cops surrounding her. Our ambulance has blue, red and white lights, a bit different from others. So when she saw them, the girl started freaking out and yelling not to let Andrea touch her. I wondered how she knew my name, and that's when I noticed it was that girl again. I said with a shocked face, "What are you doing here at this hour running in the middle of the highway?" She couldn't see me really, because of the pepper spray. It makes it so you can't see. I had the other medics flush her eyes so that it wouldn't hurt so much, and I tried to reason with her about going to the hospital, since I knew she would need something, taking into account her medical condition. I went on to learn that she was running away from home to kill herself, and had taken medication which made her do dumb things like this. I decided to get her to the hospital, stat due to her current condition. She thought she was in trouble, but I kept telling her she wasn't, and we were going to get the help she needed. We got to the hospital, and all the nurses looked at me like, "Really? You're bringing back this to us?" Note, the hospital here is awful and nobody really cares about you. They all care about the paychecks. She was admitted, and thank God, we went on our way. I really hope she got the help she needed, and that I don't see her again, for her own sake.